said, my name is Teddy Blanks. I'll just give you a little bit of background on myself. In 2009, with my partners Adam Squires and Dan Shields, I co-founded a design studio called Chips. We do a lot of different kinds of work. We do branding and identity work for cultural foundations like the National Book Foundation, like Art21. We do a lot of websites for museums, for movie theaters, for clothing brands, for indie bands, you name it. Occasionally, I'll design a book cover, but I'm not going to talk about any of that work today. I'm going to talk about the thing that I do most often, which is that I make opening titles for movies and TV. Okay, so what do we think about when we think about opening title sequences? Maybe Saul Bass or James Bond. If you're thinking about TV, maybe you think about sorry, that's my work. Maybe you think about Stranger Things or True Detective. But these are animated sequences. They're kind of like films that go before the film. And occasionally I get to do one of these, and they're really fun. And if you want to see that work, you can go to our website. But today I'm going to talk about something I do even more often. In the independent film world, you don't get the opportunity to do these opening sequences very often because usually the work is just picking a typeface for the credits and figuring out where it goes on the screen. This is the most boring thing I've ever made, by the way. And sometimes that's the right thing for the movie, is just finding sort of a boring white font and putting it pretty small in the middle of a black screen. Font doesn't have to be boring. Sometimes it can have a little bit of character or eccentricity. Sometimes if it's a period piece, maybe you try to make the font look like it came from an 18th century book or something like that, and you put that in the middle of a black screen. Or you make it a fun color. Sometimes they let you make it a fun color. It doesn't have to be in the middle of the screen. You can put it off to the side, but usually it is in the middle of the screen because that's what the director wants. It doesn't have to be a black screen. This is from a movie called White Girl, and I decided I would make the titles white on white, sort of just blind you with white light at the end of the movie. You could put it on a kind of fancy texture or bright color. So if the titles don't go at the end of the movie over black, they'll go at the beginning of the movie over picture. And often, in the case of indie movies, over sequences that weren't designed to have titles on them in the first place. So it's kind of up to me to figure out the placement and the timing and to try to make it look intentional. Where does the type look best in relation to the shot? Sometimes the footage can actually interact with the type. So this is from a movie called My Art, directed by Laurie Simmons, and you can see the main character there kind of staring at the type like it's a wall label at a museum. Sometimes my job is just to execute exactly what the director wants. So in this case, this was a TV pilot where I was asked to recreate hand-drawn titles from a 1930s French movie. This is what it's based on, so you can judge how well I did copying it. And sometimes you run into a shot that there's just nowhere good to put a title. There's white light coming out from behind it. There's a bunch of blurry stuff and lots of different colors. And no sort of color of type or placement of type will really read over top of it. So I'm going to talk about drop shadows. Sometimes I have to use a drop shadow. Coming into the film world from graphic design, I was taught that drop shadows were bad, and that if anyone ever asked me to use one, I should argue vehemently against it, which I did a lot. But it turns out that the history of film titles, there's drop shadows all over the place. So this image on the left is from 1925, and the one on the right is from 1933. These are just straight up paintings, and you can see a lot of effort was put into making the letters look dimensional, to making it look like there's a real light source and that the shadows look sort of real. When you got to the 50s and 60s and people were putting type over top of picture, the drop shadow sort of becomes this little sliver of black that's attached to the type. So just to say what I mean there, on the left here is the original opening title screen for Singin' in the Rain, and on the right is something I made in Photoshop, where I use Photoshop's drop shadow effect on the Singin' in the Rain title. So you can see how on the left, The drop shadow is actually like a 3D protrusion from the letters, and on the right, Photoshop just takes the type and offsets it from the foreground. This kind of style of drop shadow became really, really prominent in the 70s and 80s. You would see it everywhere, and then into the kind of 90s, and then digital titling started and it kind of went away. But I've kind of figured out how to make it, and I have started using it in my own work, and not just when I need to have type stand out. Sometimes a director will use a certain type of zoom lens or a song on the soundtrack to evoke an earlier era in film. I find that this drop shadow on film titles does the same thing. It feels really cozy to me. It feels familiar. It feels like what movie titles were like when I was a kid. So this is a question I get a lot. Can you make it look less digital? And so a lot of what I do is reaching back to an earlier era. Right now you have a whole generation of directors that grew up watching film, that are in love with film as a medium, but they don't have the means or the access to actually shoot on film. So there's a lot of tricks you do in post-production to try to make the thing you shot digitally look more like what film looks like. And I try to bring that into my work as well. This is an optical printer. I've never actually seen one, so everything I'm going to tell you about is just stuff that I read on the internet like 3 days ago. So apparently what happens, this is how they used to make a lot of special effects and also film titles. Apparently what happens is you put two strips of film in one end, one has the titles on, the other one has the footage on it, and then there's a camera inside somewhere that shoots that film on top of the footage, and then it spits out a new one at the end or something where the film is on top of the footage. All I know is that this process results in a lot of kind of really beautiful irregularities and artifacts. So this is one thing I do to try to kind of curb the digital look of titles, because I find that when I go see a movie and it's just a white type on black, even if the font looks good, often, because it's being projected digitally, you can see the pixels. It really takes me out of the movie. So this is another thing that is maybe going to be sacrilegious in this room, but I add a little blur to the type, just a little tiny, I just blur it just a little, not enough to make it look blurry, just enough to make it kind of fade into the background a little bit so it feels like it's part of the movie. This is a movie I worked on last year, Lady Bird. The director, Greta Gerwig, was really adamant that the type not look digital at all, that it almost had like a tactile kind of handmade quality to it. I had designed this logo a couple years earlier, when she was raising money for the film. I had read the script and I knew that the main character went to a Catholic high school, so I thought it should look vaguely biblical, so this black letter typeface is what I chose. But when it came time to do the film, because she wanted this kind of handmade quality, we brought on the illustrator and artist and author Leanne Shapton, who does a lot of stuff with painted lettering, and saw if she could make kind of a handmade version of the titles. So this is the first thing that she did, which I think is beautiful. But Greta felt that it shouldn't look like it was made by hand. You shouldn't be able to immediately tell that it was a sketchy drawing or something, that it should feel a little more solid. So it kind of evolved, and then eventually this is the final title treatment. So it's like close to typography, but it actually is a painting. And so Leanne and I developed this process where I would set the names in type, then I would send them to her, and she would send me back these kind of paintings. They were just a little wonkier than the type that I had sent her. And then I would shrink them way down and position them on the screen. And this is what it looks like in the film. So a few years ago, I worked on a Brian Wilson biopic called Love and Mercy. It takes place in two eras, in the late 60s when Brian Wilson is going crazy trying to record his album Smile, and in the late 80s when he's kind of coming out of many years of mental illness and isolation. And the director, Bill Pohlad, he wanted to kind of dispense with the early part of the Beach Boys, the early 60s, really quickly in the opening title sequence. And his plan was he shot all of this great footage of the band, not the real band, the actors playing the band, performing all your favorite Beach Boys hits, and just kind of got through it in 3 minutes. And he wanted to kind of take that footage and It was already shot on film, but he wanted to print it again on film and then kind of rough it up so it had this vintage quality that the rest of the film lacked. And his plan was then to put titles over top of that. And I said, well, why don't we try putting the titles on before you run it through, before you shoot it on film, and that way the titles will have the same quality. So this is the result of that process. Oh, there's no sound.
So my part in the chorus against the band alternates with the intro back in the melody. Just gets around.
Round, round, get around, I get around, yeah, get around, round, round, I get around.
All right. So a few years after that, I got the opportunity to work with one of my favorite directors, James Gray, who made The Immigrant and Two Lovers, on a film he was working on called Lost City of Z. He shot it on film in the rainforest. It's a period piece about a British cartographer who goes in the Amazon jungle in search of a lost city. And again, shot on film, he had this concern. He did not want the titles to look digital. He wanted them to look like old optical film titles. So I said, James, baby, don't worry about it. I got this. I worked on this Beach Boys movie a few years ago. We printed the titles to film. It looks great. So we did the same process. We sent the titles off to the lab, and this is what we got back. And he looked at it and he said, it looks horrible. It looks like you're kind of faking this old-timey movie titles. We can't use that at all. It's too jittery. So this is the final title over picture. What I ended up doing was just faking the jitter in After Effects. So it's much subtler, but it somehow looks more convincingly like a real film title. Go figure. Okay, so just because I'm not making a full-fledged title sequence for a movie doesn't mean that I'm not allowed to do anything but pick the font. So occasionally, if I have an idea to elevate the titles, a director will be pretty receptive to it as long as it doesn't elevate the budget. This is a movie that's out right now. It's called Hereditary. It's scary as hell. You should go see it. And without spoiling the plot at all, I'll just say that the title itself is important. It's about the things that we sort of pass along to our children. So we went through a fairly quick design process here. He was getting ready for the Sundance Film Festival, and I showed him a few type options. He chose this one. It was going to be really simple. They were just going to fade in and out. And then I think a couple days before we were delivering the sequence, I had this idea for an animated thing that could kind of give the titles some more resonance. So I'll just show that to you now.
Ice cream castles in the air and feathered canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way, but now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone.
Right before the movie was released, one of the producers called me and said, well, we rearranged a bunch of the titles. We have to redo them. And I almost had a panic attack, because if each title doesn't have a letter that the previous title has, and the whole sequence falls apart. Luckily, it still worked. Okay, so if I don't have a good idea for a title sequence, I will usually just rip something off. You guys might recognize this fella. This is Hobo, designed by Morris Fuller Benton. Super cheesy, really wacky looking. I love it so much. So the director, David Lowery, approached me earlier this year about a movie he was making with Robert Redford about an aging bank robber called The Old Man and the Gun. So I started running this title through my brain, The Old Man and the Gun. It reminded me of an earlier title of a Robert Redford movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Then when I was doing some research for that, looking at the titles of Butch Cassidy, I stumbled upon this Robert Redford movie I hadn't heard of, Little Foss and Big Housey. So I said to David, you know, I think we have a duty here to film history. You don't want to be the only director to make a Robert Redford movie with "and" in the title that doesn't use hobo for the main titles. So this is what's in the movie, guys. That's how you convince a director to use hobo in a movie. Okay, so I'll get back to The Old Man and the Gun in a second, but I want to talk about some rules and conventions when designing for movies that I've always found particularly strange. So we all know that when we're designing books or magazines, we work in a grid. When you're designing for film titles, this is your grid. These two lines are baked into every single professional editing software. The Avid, they're in Premiere, they're in After Effects. You're looking at them the whole time you're working. I'm going to tell you what the one in the middle means. That's the title safe zone. You're not supposed to leave that zone. It's 80% of the screen size, and legend says that if you go outside the zone, the titles are going to get cut off on somebody's screen. Well, I'm here to tell you that's bullshit. So there was a time when everyone had cathode ray televisions where routinely 10 to 20% of the image was being cut off by the edge of the TV. But that's not how people watch movies today. Digital projectors are calibrated to the size of the screen in movie theaters. People watch on flat screen TVs, they watch on their laptops, they watch on their phones. They are seeing the whole image. The title is safe. You can put it in the corner of the screen if you want to. The trouble is if you're working in television or if you're working in studio films, they're not gonna let you do this. There are just too many roadblocks, too many people who will say no. But if you're working in independent film and you have a director like David Lowery who will say to every single person along the way, the producer, the post-production supervisor, the colorist, the quality control people who give you back a sheet that says, hey, look, you went outside title safe. If he will say to all of those people, no, we meant to do it, we meant to put the type in the corner of the screen, then the movie can get released with the type outside of title safe and you won't get arrested. So just that's a tip for you. So to close, I'd like to talk about my least favorite thing about title design, which is the end crawl, which is what we call the long scrolling credits with every single name of every person who worked on the movie at the end of it. Because I'm a perfectionist, when I do these things, I spend a very long time trying to make them look nice, and then there are just changes upon changes upon changes up until the very last minute, and sometimes after that. So I try to farm it off to other people. There are third-party companies that do it great, that have automated ways of making the end crawl, but occasionally, you know, for budget reasons, because the budget is either high enough that they want to just hire one person to do everything, I'll end up doing an end crawl, or if I like the movie and the budget is low enough that they can't afford to hire anyone else, I'll end up kind of stuck with it. So when I do them, I try to kind of have a little fun with it. Before I say goodbye, I'm going to play you an end crawl I made for a movie called Thirst Street, directed by Nathan Silver. Don't worry, you don't have to watch the whole thing. And by the way, you never do. You can always walk out of a movie before the end titles are done. It's not, you know, it's fine. I really like this song, and I thought, you know, the titles just seem so rigid to me, the way they were just going up. So I thought, you know, why not make them dance a little bit, right? Thanks so much, everybody.